And the idea here for today is we're going to talk about poster presentation development, design process. There's a number of events coming up. We'll talk more about that at the end as well. There's the URSA sponsored Research and Creative Activity Day, which is coming up in April. But there's other events like the BLAST conference. There's a couple of other on-campus opportunities for students to present, as well as off-campus opportunities as well. So the goal here is to provide some basic information about how one might develop a poster, especially if you've never developed one before. It can be a bit of a daunting task. So the plan for today is to kind of touch on four things. One are just some basic general considerations for poster design. Talk about some specific components that should show up in a poster. And I'm going to use one of my posters as a sort of a template to kind of guide us through that process. And then talk about some things that aren't on my poster and why that is and how you can sort of work around that and things you might want to consider. Talk about some of the post resources that we provide at URSA that you can take advantage of. And then what opportunities are out there for presentations. Like I mentioned, RCA Day, Research and Creative Activity Day is one of those coming up, but there's other ones as well. So with that in mind, let's start off with some general considerations. One of the things I always tell anybody when they're sort of putting together a poster is a couple of things to keep in mind. There's two ways that you can present, right? You can give a poster or you can give an oral presentation. One's not better than the other. They're just different. They're different. Usually they're sort of often at different sort of types of audiences, different expectations, differences in terms of maybe where you're at in the study. For example, a lot of times, if a study kind of has preliminary results, you might present it as a poster. And then as you get your results more finalized, present it as an oral presentation when you're nearing the end. That isn't always an absolute, but that's often what happens in a lot of cases. But regardless, you've decided you're going to present a poster, again, at a UAF event or at an on-campus event. You made that commitment. A couple things to keep in mind. The first one is to know your audience. Who are you presenting to? If you're presenting at a conference or some type of an event, who are the people that you're going to be talking to? What is their knowledge base? Because one of the things we're going to talk about here in a second is what are you going to convey to them as far as information? So knowing their background, their information. So it might be something very specific. So if you're presenting at a very sort of topic-based conference, you might have a different sort of preparation for that than if you're presenting at something more general. So for example, Research and Creative Activity Day is a broad conference that has faculty, staff, and students from the entire campus that come to it. And so in that case, you might be talking to people who have no knowledge about what you're talking about. They don't know that area. That's not their discipline. They don't have any prior information versus a very specific conference. So I'll pick on you for a second, Kristen. You said you're going to present at the One Health conference. That's a very different conference than Research and Creative Activity Day. So your preparation might be a little bit different for that. Just being aware who your audience is really kind of key because the information you might provide, the jargon you will use might be a little bit different depending on your audience. One of the fundamental differences between a poster and an oral presentation is that the poster really is a conversation starter. You know, when you're giving an oral presentation, you're standing in front of a group of people, you've got your slides, your PowerPoint behind you, and you're walking your audience through, you're doing all the talking, right? Until you get to the end, that Q&A session where people can ask you questions. In the case of a poster, the entire thing is a Q&A session, basically. You're giving a spiel, and I'll come back to that here in a second because I'm going to talk about elevator pitch in a second, but you're usually walking your audience member. So for example, here's a student, and then talking to a mentor or another faculty member, staff member, and you're explaining to them what your poster is about. They may actually read it. They can read it by themselves if they want to. But in a lot of cases, this is an opportunity for you to actually start a conversation, talk to them about your research, what you did, why it was important, what were the take-home messages. And that's where that elevator pitch comes in. Something that you should prepare for, and this is again knowing your audience, is about a 2 to 3 minute elevator pitch. So for example, when I go to a poster session and I walk up to a student, I'll say, hi, how you doing? What's your name? Those kinds of things. And then I'll say, tell me about your project before I actually usually sit down and take a look at it. What I'm asking that student to do is give me in 2 to 3 minutes an overview of what they did. So why did you do this? Why was it important? What were your objectives? Maybe briefly kind of what you did as far as collecting information, field work, lab work, maybe some analyses. But mostly what I want to hear is about your results. What'd you find? Why is that of interest? What are the conclusions you drew from it? Again, in 2 to 3 minutes. So it's a synopsis of your poster. I can then go back and look at more in-depth specific things and ask questions based on that. I might generate questions based on our conversation. But the idea here is, again, someone's going to walk up to you, or multiple people are going to walk up to you. As you're talking to somebody, other people are going to walk up to you as well. So there might be a crowd of people around you listening to what you're saying, listening to the Q&A session, other people jumping in, asking questions as well. But it's a way to sort of generate conversation. It's a much more, I think, personal way to give a presentation relative to an oral presentation where you're standing alone in front of a bunch of people talking, which can be kind of terrifying for some individuals. So a poster is a great way to kind of sort of build some confidence in presenting in front of people, because it's often one-on-one or small groups in most cases. It might be other students, it might be, again, faculty, might be staff. So my point here is, make sure you walk into your poster session with an elevator pitch. What is your 2 to 3 minute spiel that if I say, give me the synopsis of your presentation, what you did, you can sort of drop that. Again, it may not be word for word exactly the same every time, but the gist is there every single time. One of the real advantages of poster sessions is a chance to network and engage. And you've heard that term maybe before. Networking is a real important aspect of going to any conference or meeting. This is where you're going to meet peers. You're going to meet potential employers. It's a chance to have conversations with them, hear more about opportunities. These can end up getting you a job, grad school. And so take advantage of those. Again, posters can be really challenging for those of us that are introverted, where if you don't like talking, a poster session can be really challenging. So it kind of makes you kind of break out of your shell to some extent. But nevertheless, it's a good experience to, again, meet other people in your field. And again, that can lead to opportunities down the road. So I think doing at least one poster session at some point in time during your again, undergraduate or if you go to graduate school, graduate career is a really important skill set to develop, because, again, what we do is, again, regardless of the type of project that we work on, whether it's a STEM-based research study, thinking about experimental design, those kinds of things, or some kind of creative project that we've developed, creative display or something, being able to communicate what you did, why you did it, why it's important is really important. And talking to people outside of your area of interest, outside of your discipline, is also important as well. And then the other thing I'll mention here, and this is kind of a tough one, but poster design is really important, which is mostly what we're going to focus on today. But there's a lot of personal preference here. And so what I'm going to communicate to you isn't the be all end all of posters. There's different styles. If you can Google posters in whatever discipline you're in, and you'll see lots of different examples out there. And so don't feel like what I talk about today is the only way that a poster can be developed. It's not. There's a lot of personal style that goes into this. There's some things you don't want to do. We'll talk about that to some extent, but there's a lot of variation in poster design. And I would encourage you to, Kristen, when you're at your One Health conference, take a look at some of the other posters and get some ideas. If you go to a research and creative activity day, and I would encourage all students to do that, take a look at the different posters. You can see, what's really good and effective way to present information, and maybe some not so effective ways to present information as well. And then using that knowledge and as you're sort of crafting your next poster. So those are some basic considerations. I've got a few more, but before I move on, any questions at this point? All right. So this kind of gets at general considerations for the actual poster design itself. So sort of segueing in from the end of our last slide. And one of these is kind of, some of this is going to seem kind of contradictory. And the first one is a good example of that. Use all of the space, but white space is important. So what you don't want to have is a poster that's mostly white space. And by white space, it doesn't mean that it's going to be just white. If you look at this poster here, the poster background is this sort of aqua blue color. And so that's considered white space. White space is anything that doesn't have words or a picture or something. So you're going to have to play around with this sort of using the space, but not so much space that it seems cluttered. And you don't want to have a lot of white space where it looks like there's nothing there, or you didn't take advantage of the space you have, so you don't have enough information on what you're presenting. So you gotta have to play around with it. And I can't give you some like rule of thumb, like this percentage of your poster must be covered with words and this percentage must not be. It's just one of the things you kind of have to work through, looking at other examples as you're developing your poster. What looks good is kind of important as well to keep that in mind. We'll come back to that here in a second and get a look at some examples. Another important consideration is the flow of information. I should say this. Most posters that I've seen, and most of the ones that are out there, are often 3 panels. So you have like a title block across the top. Can you see my cursor moving there? Okay. So there's a title block across the top, and there's 3 panels. And they go from left to right, top to bottom. So the beginning of your poster is right here, and you flow in this direction, and then up to the middle, and then down, and up to the rightmost panel, and then down. That's the general flow of information. So if you think about a scientific poster, right, with introduction, objectives, methods, results, conclusions, that's usually the flow. Introduction, objectives, methods, results, maybe some more results, conclusions, acknowledgements, references, things like that over here. That's the usual flow. So left to right, top to bottom as you're working through your panels. And that 3-panel approach is a pretty common approach. And on the one example I'm going to show here in a minute, it's going to be blown up. That's the approach that we use. And that's one that you see most commonly used in most posters. It's not the only style, but it's the most commonly used style. Make sure you label any graphics that you have on your poster. So any pictures, any figures, any tables should have a caption. Don't leave it to your audience to figure out what it is. So ideally, your poster should be a standalone document, so to speak, to where if you weren't standing next to your poster, I could walk up to it and figure out. I could read through, following along the intro, and read through the introduction. Why is this important? Here are your objectives. Here's a figure. Here's a map of maybe where you did your field work. So it's got some kind of caption beneath that describes where this was and sample sites if you did that. Or you've got pictures of maybe some lab technique that you used, or you've got your data tables or data figures, again, explaining what those are. All your axes are described. You've got your legends, all that. So basically, if I looked at this figure, I can figure out what's in here. I know what that information is. So make sure you have all that information there. And again, working with your mentor is key here. So make sure you run a draft of your poster through your mentor so they can catch these, or peers. Having other individuals look at your poster is also really handy as well. So if you miss something, and that happens, especially the first time, you get that feedback, which can be really valuable to make sure you incorporate what you need. So everything is fully described. Font size is one of those sort of tricky ones. You don't want really tiny font where I have to stand up right next to the poster to see. Someone should be able to read your poster from 2 to 3 feet away. So choosing a font size that is easily viewable in a color that makes some sense. Keep in mind, if you had, as an example, a green background with red lettering, like red words, don't do that. Okay, that someone who's red, green colorblind might not be able to read that very well. So you need to kind of look at color schemes, and keep in mind that sometimes color schemes, as you see them on a computer screen when you're putting your poster together, how it actually prints out might not translate out that same way. I'm going to give you an example here in a minute that is probably an example of what not to do, because it's a dark background with light words. Depending on the poster printer and the type of paper being used, you can get some runoff sometimes and bleeding across that. I typically encourage students to have light background posters with dark words. That tends to, one, it takes less ink, but also it tends to be more readable. So like this poster I'm going to show you, it's a computer poster. That it's not one that we would print out and put somewhere, because like I said, it takes up a ton of ink and it can be kind of hard to read if it was actually printed. But we'll talk about some more aspects related to that as well. And then another piece of contradictory information: keep your word count low. So I said use up all the space, but also you don't want to be too wordy in your posters. And the general trend over time has been to have less wordy posters, less verbose posters. Again, the idea is to generate conversation. It shouldn't be that if I come to your poster, I have a choice. I can talk to you, or I can read your poster, and I choose to read your poster instead because I'm an introvert and I don't want to talk to people. That's not what you want. You want to engage your audience. Now, if you're not there, you want your audience to be able to read your poster and figure out what's going on. But during the poster session itself, that's not what you want. So again, I've given you some contradictory information about how you structure your poster. And a lot of it, quite honestly, is sort of playing around with it. It's kind of what looks good, what makes sense. It has enough information, but not too much information. Again, working with your mentor, someone that has a lot of experience, perhaps with putting posters together, you can run it through us as well. We can give you some feedback too. So this is a learning experience, especially if you've never done it before. And like I said, there's no right or wrong way. As a matter of fact, my graduate students just asked me the other day if I will give a poster session to them so they know how to put together a poster. So at the undergraduate level, you might not have a lot of experience with it. Even at the graduate level, you may not have a lot of experience with it as well. And the only way to get that experience is to do it. So that's what you're going to be doing here soon. So get some basic aspects about style and design. But again, there's a lot of opportunity for your own personal style being interjected here as well. Okay, so here's the poster I'm going to use. And what I'm going to do for a sec, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm just going to go to the poster itself because this is too small. So this is the poster I'm going to use as my example. The first thing I'm going to say is, like I mentioned, the background is dark. So it's blue, dark blue. If this was to be printed out, it would not turn out very well just because it's going to use a ton of ink. And there's a good chance when you use a lot of ink, there can be bleeding, especially if you across colors. So you get a lot of bleeding of the blue into the white and the yellow. And so that's why often using a light colored background with darker lettering can be a better way to do this. So, but for what I was using in this case, it worked fine. But what I wanted to go to were the components that you need to include in a poster that are essential. And we'll talk about some other ones that I would say are more optional, or maybe dependent upon where you're at with your study. The first thing I'll mention here, and this is the top, and this is essential for all posters, is this title block, or what's called the title block or author block, different names. It's this block that across the very top of your poster that goes from side to side, that has the title of your presentation, that has the list of authors. So that would be you, obviously, as the lead author of the presentation, your mentor, anybody else who may have played a role in that study in some way. Again, this is where having conversation with your mentor really becomes important, is who else gets included in your author block or title block. And then the affiliations for everybody. And so in this case, we've got myself, one of my grad students, and then an ADF&G biologist. And so we've got these little superscripts that refer back to the addresses. So one in this case is our the UAF address. The two in the case is ADF&G address. In your case, it might just be, if it says you and your mentor and you're both at UAF, it just be your UAF address. You don't need to put your email. You don't need to put your phone number, anything like that, just your affiliation. Some other things I'll come back to a little bit later. There's some white space right here on either side, even though it's not white space, it's blue space, but open space. These are great places to put logos. And I'll talk about logos at the very end. So you'll want to put the URSA logo. You may want to put the UAF logo here, and there's ways you can get that off the web. Sometimes I've seen students put pictures of themselves up here. That's okay too. Sometimes I've seen students put the picture of their organism or what they're working on up there, but there might be ways to sort of intersperse that somewhere else in the poster, depending on how you've got it structured. So you got your title block across the top. Usually your title is going to be larger letters. Those may be bolded, they may not be bolded. Larger letters than the authors and the affiliations. They may or may not be different colors. Again, that's a personal preference. Make sure, one of the things I'll mention, it's really easy to especially when you're putting these posters together because you're doing it in PowerPoint, and the text and PowerPoint can be small unless you're blowing this up. And so, and we can do that. We can, I don't know if this will, when I zoom in, does it zoom in? So it's really easy to have typos and when you have small font, when you're looking at it and at the whole image. And so make sure you sort of catch those kinds of things. So the title block is the first thing we're going to include. And like I mentioned, this is a tri-panel poster. So the flow is from left to right, top to bottom. So I've got introduction that includes the objectives. I've got methods. I've got results. I've got more results. I've got some sort of future research, and I've got some acknowledgments. That's one group of things. We'll talk about these. And this is kind of what I would call kind of a moderate poster in terms of text. It's not super text heavy, but it's not super text light either, sort of in the middle ground of that. And so for this introduction section, or background, however you want to term that, justification, we've got a research question to start it off, a little bit of background information here, a picture of our study organism. As you see, I've already violated one of the things I told you to do is we should put captions on all your figures. There's no caption there. So if you don't know those are lamprey, you're not going to know what they are. So don't do everything I did here. And then I've got my research objectives. So those could be your study goal, objectives, if appropriate, hypotheses, if appropriate. Those might be a single statement. It might be multiple statements, depending on, again, the nature of your study. But something needs to be there at the beginning. Here's why this study was important, and here's what I did, and why, kind of a thing. And so that's on that leftmost panel. That's it's about 40% of my space there, and I try to leave enough white space so that it's kind of centered. And again, used up as much of the space as possible, but it doesn't look too cluttered. Try to use some different colors to kind of offset things a little bit. So stylistically, try to make it, again, visually appealing. To me, that's visually appealing, but to you, that might not be visually appealing. So again, that's where that personal preference comes in there, and getting feedback from your mentor and your peers is really handy. And looking at lots of other posters gives you ideas like what you like and what you don't like. And it's like, we've all been through PowerPoint presentations. Some people think a set of slides are awesome. Some people think that's the worst group of slides I've ever seen in my life. Again, so there's a lot of personal preference here. But anyway, you need some kind of a background, justification, introduction to start it off. You'll have some type of a methods. And so that could be, again, research methods, right? Experimental design, field work, lab work that you did, data analyses. If it's a creative display, it might be kind of how if you're doing some type of as an example, ceramics project, what it is you did to build your piece or pieces that you put together, or whatever it was you might have done, or maybe you're putting together some kind of visual display, like how you constructed that, whatever you put together. And so in this case, I set up, I got some methods, some field collections of animals, in this case lamprey, some habitat data we collected, and some other analyses that we did. And those headers all correspond back to objectives. So I've got 3 headers under my methods. Those correspond back to objectives 1, 2, and 3. Again, that's just to kind of help the author or the reader and guide them along that process. Use some wording and try not to use complete sentences in these cases. And that's kind of a trend I've seen in some posters. Again, that sort of less is more approach, having keywords there so that, I'm expecting you to explain this to me as the author. But if I came across this poster and you weren't there, I could probably figure it out on my own as well. So there's kind of that sort of sweet spot in between those two areas. And again, that's a very discipline specific type of a thing. So if you're at a One Health conference, you can maybe be able to get away with something like that. But at an RCA Day type of a conference where your audience could be anybody, someone in your discipline, then you might need a few more words to help explain what it is you're doing. So your poster might be a little bit different. I tend to tell people that, again, that first panel, or students or anybody else, that first panel on the left is introduction and methods, and try to get everything in there that you need in that panel. What most people want to see in a presentation are results. And that's why we want to go see, we want to find out what somebody did, but what they found out specifically. So that middle panel is always going to be all results, and maybe even part of the rightmost panel as well. And so I tend to structure my posters to where that middle panel is mostly visual. And so I've got a map of a study area. So again, on my 3 objectives, objectives 1, 2, and 3 that correspond back to objectives 1, 2, and 3, correspond back to my methods 1, 2, and 3. So I've got a map. I've got another picture that I didn't describe with no caption. I've got a table of data here. I've got a table of data here, a couple of more figures with some nice pictures, some histograms and a regression here. I didn't describe anything here, right? I just have visuals of my figures and my pictures and my tables, and that's all it is with captions and minus one image there. I tend to like that approach. I think, again, giving space to your results is really important, because that's, again, what most people are there to see, what it is, what you did, and what did you find out. And I didn't really explain anything here, but that's where I use this part over here on the right for this summarization of this was a preliminary poster, the preliminary results, again, tied back to objectives 1, 2, and 3. I'll admit I'm not super happy with this because I think it's too verbose. I think there's too much wording there. And so in hindsight, what I wish I would have done is made this maybe more bullet point style under each of those objectives. And so maybe have the high points that correspond back to each of these tables or figures as far as what was the primary result being found, versus having to sit there and read through the whole thing. Again, this isn't like reading a scientific paper where you're expected to do that. This is, again, more of a visual display of your study. And so if I were to go back and redo this poster, I would probably pick something a little more like this, where, well, this is maybe a little bit too verbose here, but more bullet point style like I did here in the methods. Because this is preliminary, I didn't have any conclusions. I don't have any discussion. So if I was going to continue, as we finish this project, and actually this particular project ended up being, it's going right into a paper that we published. In that paper, we had the conclusions and all that kind of thing. I'll come back to that here in a second. I did have a section on future research because we were going to do some additional sampling and some analyses based on that. That may be something you have. It may be something if you don't have. If you're at the end of your study and there's no opportunity for future research, then you wouldn't have that section in there. But if there's, in most cases, most projects lead to other opportunities. New things come about, right? Questions come up that you didn't know about, or maybe you didn't answer everything that you thought you were going to answer. So there usually is an opportunity for future research or future projects, or maybe you're making some kind of creative display and the technique you used didn't work or didn't yield the result you wanted. And so you learned something. Here's maybe something I would have done differently the next time around. That can be something you would include in there as well. You definitely need an acknowledgement section. Now that acknowledgements can include, again, anybody who helped you out that's not in your author string. So you wouldn't include anybody in your acknowledgements that's in your author string or your author block up here. So you wouldn't include your mentor here. If you have lab mates or other folks that are listed up in the author string, you would include them here. But other people that maybe didn't help you to the extent that would show up in the author stream, but nevertheless made a contribution, maybe with ideas, or again, you shared ideas with, you brainstormed with, you ran your poster by them to get some feedback. Maybe they helped you in the lab, or they helped you in the field, or they helped you in the studio, or wherever you're doing your project. Your funding sources should be listed here. So if you have URSA funding, BLAST funding, some external source of funding, UAF funding, whatever that might be, you'd include that here, that as well. Again, I have another one of these pictures without a caption there, but those are the kind of the basic aspects that show up in all posters, right? You have a title block with the authors and the author string. You have some type of an introduction, background, justification. The objectives, goals, hypotheses could be separate from this. They don't have to be part of this. It's sort of, again, that's personal preference. Some type of methods, experimental design, analyses, how you got to the results or the product that you produced. The bulk of your poster should be results, or again, the product that you put together. Maybe some summarization or discussion or conclusions, potentially some future research, and then acknowledgments. Those are the basic aspects that show up in most posters. And if you take a look at you could on the URSA website, there's lots of examples you can look at. You could Google posters for your disciplinary and look at them as well. You'll see the same basic components to it. So before I move on to some other optional components, I want to give a chance for any questions or comments that either of you two have.
I'll just say that there's also, so you can see previous URSA RCA Day examples from the last 2 years. They're linked to the presenters on the website. So that's a good place to check that out specifically. And then we also have the presenter resources page that kind of gives a little bit more information about, I guess, like sizes and printing do's and don'ts for our specific printer and whatnot. But this video will be on that one too. So
yep, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit too. It's part of this poster presentation.
How about a photo credit? How do you credit the person who took the photo?
I'll put that in the caption. So, for example, it might be as an example, say this picture down here, this lamprey picture. Obviously, that lamprey is in my hands. I did not take that picture. There's no way I could have taken that picture, right? Unless I'm holding the camera in my mouth. So somebody else took that picture. So I might put, I don't know, I'm just making this up, figure or image 3, I guess it would be, or whatever it would be. Larval lamprey, and then in parentheses I might put photo credit Aaron Kirchner, for example, or something like that, or image taken by Aaron Kirchner, or whoever might have taken that picture. My grad student took that picture, Aaron Dupuis. So, but yeah, you just put that in the caption below it and give attribution for that for sure. Some other things to think about, including, like I said, there's things you need to have in your poster, but some other things. The question comes up, historically, abstracts always showed up on a poster. And that's kind of not the case anymore. If they did show up, they would be right here at the very beginning of the poster. But what a lot of folks do nowadays is they bring extra copies of the abstract. So on individual sheets of paper with your contact information. So your name, your email address, for example, maybe phone number, depending on if you're wanting to give that out. And then you have them with your poster hanging on a folder, usually at the bottom of the poster board. And that way, if somebody says, "Oh, that's a pretty cool poster. I might want to follow up with you on that." They can take a copy of your abstract, so they have that information and your contact information, and they can get a hold of you later. That's a great way if you don't have business cards to get out your email, especially if you're networking, trying to find a job, trying to go to grad school, wanting to develop that dialogue. That's a great way to get the information out so people remember. Because keep in mind, if you're at a poster session, there might be dozens, if not hundreds, of posters. It's pretty easy to kind of forget about something like that. So if I take your abstract with me with your contact information, I'm going to remember that and get back to you later. So that's I think a great tool to take that approach. These other things I kind of mentioned before, if you have a project, like I said, the poster that I showed here is preliminary data. We weren't done with the study. We had more field work that had to be conducted the next year. So we built on that. So I didn't present a discussion where I actually embedded the literature within the results. And I also don't have any conclusions because we weren't done yet. But if you are at the end of your study, maybe instead of presentation of preliminary results, you would have the discussion or conclusions there instead. Again, it depends where you're at with your study. If you do have discussion where you've got embedded within that the literature, then you also need to include references. So if you cited a bunch of papers in that, then you might have a little section on the bottom with the list of the references with the citations for those. Again, giving attribution to those is important. So that can actually, as you can imagine, can kind of clutter things up a little bit. So you kind of have to play around with spacing. A lot of times I've seen examples where the references are provided, or maybe they're actually provided, but they're really small on the bottom, which can make it kind of hard to see. But I've also seen where they have a list of the references on a separate sheet of paper that are there, so people can grab those if they wanted to as well. I've also seen examples, and this is kind of cool, where people will print out their poster on a sheet of paper. Again, the same idea. You got it there with your poster. I just talked to you about your poster, and I'm interested in it. I want to learn more about it, or I want to maybe talk to you more. I'll take a picture of that poster with me, that on that one pager, and that way I have it and I can refer back to you because it's got your contact information in it as well. So there's a couple ways you can do that are kind of creative. And again, a big part of giving a poster is having that conversation, generating that dialogue with your audience members that are viewing your poster and learning about what you did. And that's what you want. You don't want to just stand there for an hour, 2 hours by yourself, not talking to anybody. That's not the point of a poster session. So, and again, it can often lead to some other opportunities after the fact as well, as far as, again, communications and networking. So some things to think about. Like I said, these aren't necessary. You don't have to have your abstract. You don't have to have these other sections if they're not relevant. You don't have to have references if that's not appropriate, but you may want to consider that if you're at that stage of your project. Questions? Okay. So Aaron stole my thunder on these, but I'll go through this anyway. If you go to our URSA website, there's some information about poster specifications. So we will print posters for free for undergraduate students. So if you have a poster, now you can go get it printed out at various locations. There's a cost to that. It can be kind of expensive, $100, couple $100, depending on how big and colors and all that kind of thing. We'll do it for free. So take advantage of that opportunity. Certainly, if you're participating in Research and Creative Activity Day, we'll definitely print your poster for free. But quite honestly, we do it for any undergraduate student that brings a poster by. So I encourage students to take advantage of that, because the poster printing is not cheap if you have to actually have it printed out somewhere where you have to pay for it. Our poster printer, so we have a large plotter, can print a poster that's 36 inches by 48 inches. That's the biggest it can be. It can be smaller than that, but it can't be any bigger than that. And when you submit the file to Aaron, the file has to be smaller than 50 megabytes. I encourage all students, before they submit their poster, have multiple people look at it. Again, you know how it is when you write something, or when you're putting together a poster or a PowerPoint. It's really easy when you look at something repeatedly over a short period of time to miss out. You miss little typos, to think something looks good. Give yourself enough time to where you can have other people take a look at it to give you feedback. The goal isn't to be critical, it's to be helpful, right? So again, that could be your peers from your class. It's certainly your mentor. Always have your mentor take a look at your poster before you submit it. Anybody else who's on that author string should have a chance to look at it as well. Again, your classmates, your peers, your spouse, your kids, whoever might be able to, you think, could give you a critical eye. Aaron and or myself are willing to look at it. As long as you give folks enough time, I think people are willing to look at it. What you don't want to do is, here's my poster, is due in an hour. Can you take a look at it? That's not a good strategy. You're probably not going to get the best feedback that way, if you get any feedback at all. So take advantage of getting that feedback to make sure you caught all the typos. The alignments of things look good. There's enough white space, not too much white space. Everything's labeled appropriately. It's really easy to miss things because there's a lot on a poster, and it's easy to miss something, especially the first time you do it. So questions or any comments, Aaron, because you've dealt with these a few times.
Yeah, so the only other piece of advice that I have is, I guess, doubling down on trends, which is don't wait till the last minute. Even if you look at it on the screen and your mentor thinks it's great and you think it's great, sometimes when it prints, it doesn't print right on the printer, or something is slightly blurry. And if I have time to kind of print it and see how it turns out before you need to pick it up that afternoon to get on a plane or something like that to go present, then we can reprint it. You have time to change things around and make it look the best as possible. But if it's you come in here, your plane is in 5 hours and you need it right now kind of a thing, we're kind of working with what we have. So we will reprint until it's at the quality it needs to be, kind of a thing, but you need to be able to give yourself enough time to do that. So.
And something else to keep in mind for Research and Creative Activity Day, there, sort of pre-pandemic days, we'd have as many as 150 presentations. So that's 150 posters, or maybe not all posters, because there's a lot of other types of presentations to creative displays presented that weren't posters, but over 100 posters. That's a lot of printing we're doing in a short period of time, usually all within that week of the event itself. So again, to get back to Aaron's point, give yourself enough time, especially because there can be problems, how you view things on a computer screen and how it actually translates to a live printed document. it can be very different. There's also compatibility issues with computers. Unfortunately, that happens all the time as well. So your computer the specs don't quite match up the same with Aaron's computer. And so there can be some goofiness going on there. So you just want to leave yourself enough time to where invariably assume there's going to be a problem and you got yourself enough time still available to troubleshoot that problem. So you don't feel like you're, oh my God, I'm not going to get this done in time. And it's not going to happen. So definitely account for that. A couple other things. I mentioned this before about backgrounds. I think lighter backgrounds are better because you don't have a lot of ink and you don't get bleeding. The bleeding can be really problematic for gradient backgrounds, like ones that sort of grade from dark to light from top to bottom. Be careful with that just because you can bleed through your wording or the letters, numbers, whatever else you might have, and it can bleed down through your poster. In some cases, when you have like really dark backgrounds and you print those out, they're really wet at the beginning. They can smear very easily. Takes a few seconds for it to dry. So just be careful with that. That's why sometimes looking lighter backgrounds are better. The paper we use is this matte poster paper. I've seen other papers that are thinner that bleed a lot more. I don't know, Aaron, have you had any much experience with that on that paper?
No, about the only issues that we've had with printing so far this year was low resolution images or things like that, or somebody used a very, very dark blue background. And that did start to band a little bit once it moved into some different colored areas on the poster. So definitely the dark colors have a higher likelihood of maybe not printing correctly, for sure.
Like the example I used.
Yeah, that would test our printer just a little bit.
Absolutely would. The image quality is definitely one to think about. If it looks fuzzy on your computer, I guarantee it's going to look fuzzy when it prints out. So higher quality images you can use, the better off you're going to be in the long run. So I definitely, that's definitely a key thing to keep in mind. But sometimes you got to go with what you got. I mean, so that's unfortunate outcome of that. And then, if you want us to print out a poster, again, give us enough time. Again, we're more than happy to give you a quick view, but make sure you had your mentor look at it first. We don't want to tell you to do something, change something, fix something, and your mentor comes back and says, no, that's got to be on there that way. We don't want to come into that conflict. So just make sure you work with your mentor. That's the key aspect. And we've seen, unfortunately, plenty of posters that have come through there. The mentor hasn't even seen the poster yet. We don't want that to happen. I mentioned logos. And so if you go to the URSA website, there's a resources area. You can get logos. So you can get the URSA logo, which is this one right here. If your project is funded by URSA, you need to have the URSA logo on there. If it's not, in your case, Kristen, because BLAST funded your project, right? So you have a BLAST logo, I assume. It's going to go on your poster, maybe. So make sure you can download that image. There's a couple different versions of it you can get access to. Likewise, you can find the UAF logo, and there's different versions of that one you can put on your poster as well. If there's other organizations that maybe funded your project or are a participant in your project, you may include their logos as well. Again, working with your mentor, make sure you have the right logos as they should appear, and acknowledgement given for funding sources. That's really key. Funders tend to get sort of unhappy when they fund projects and then they don't see their name somewhere on that project. So make sure you just include those folks. But there's plenty of logos available on the UAF websites that you can get access to. As Aaron mentioned earlier, if you go to our resources page, there's lots of examples of posters out there. So you can take a look at these. You can look at them by discipline to get a sense for what you think looks good, what doesn't look good, verbose, not too verbose, color schemes, white space, how they laid out their figures and tables, color, how that looks. I encourage you to take a look at these because they can be very invaluable. And again, like I mentioned, there's a lot of personal style here, but these are all kind of laid out very similar in a lot of ways. There's the tri-panel style. There's actually these 4-panel styles here as well. Each of your panels is going to be a lot smaller, narrower, obviously. So again, it depends on what information you're communicating and which style you might use. And again, there's some variation there, but take a look at those. And like I said, you can Google you can look up posters in your disciplinary and you'll find countless examples that you can take a look at to get a sense for that. So something you definitely want to do at some point in time. And like I mentioned, if you're at a conference or at RCA Day, I would encourage you to take a look at other posters. Again, part of learning what works for you is also learning what doesn't work for you. And there's, like I said, a lot of personal preference that goes into that. And then the last thing I'll mention is just a kind of a, Research and Creative Activity Day is one event that we have on the UAF campus for undergraduates only. So I encourage students to present at that. If you've got an URSA funded project, you have to, but it's not restricted to only URSA funded students. Any undergraduate can present at RCA Day. And I encourage that regardless of the type of project that they do. The last 2 years, it's been virtual. We're going back to our in-person format this year. We'll be at the Wood Center on April 6th. So coming up in a couple of weeks, registration is open right now. And anybody who wants a poster display at that event, we're more than happy to print that out for them. It's in the past, like I said, it's been a pretty big event. We were growing every single year up until the pandemic. So the last time we had an in-person event was 2019. We had 150 participants roughly. I don't think we'll be anywhere near that this year, but I hope that we have more than a couple of dozen student presenters at that event. And the poster session itself is from noon to 2, and the deans will be there talking to students and giving out the Dean's Choice Awards. And we'll have an award ceremony at 4:00 with food, and the chancellor is going to be there, the provost is going to be there, and we'll give out awards and have students talk about their presentations, their posters. And this is, again, it's a big celebration of undergraduate research. So I encourage all students to come, but there's lots of other opportunities. Like, if you've got a One Health related presentation, like Kristen, then you can present at the BLAST or your BLAST presentation, in her case, at the One Health event. There's another session coming up, the Midnight Sun, and I can't think of the full name, but it's a poster session that takes place later on this spring, primarily biology, fisheries, wildlife students. They'll take place over in Murray Building. There's a couple of other events that take place on campus depending on your discipline. Of course, there's lots of other conferences outside of the university. So I encourage students to do that. And if you're doing something outside the university and you're going to be traveling to an event, we have travel funds available as well. So take advantage of that opportunity to go to a conference, give a presentation, looks great on your resume, and we'll pay for it. So that's a win-win all the way around. And then the last thing is our contact information. So if you need Aaron and or I to help you out, Aaron's the URSA coordinator. I'm the director. We're here to help you. We want to see your poster meet all of its expectations and something you're really proud of, and you can take advantage of the opportunity.